The Heritage Oak War. How HOA President Barbara Mitchell learned that some roots run deeper than property lines. Part 10 minutes, 0 seconds. Barbara Mitchell thought destroying my 150-year-old heritage joke was just enforcing HOA regulations until she discovered what happens when you threaten a botanist who knows exactly how deep corruption grows. For 8 months straight, this entitled tyrant sent violation notices demanding I cut down the tree where my husband proposed, where we married under its branches, where he took his last breath 3 years ago. Every week brought new threats typed on expensive letterhead like death sentences against living history. The sharp sound of certified mail hitting my mailbox. The smug smile during board meetings, where she wielded power like a weapon. Whispered promises about eminent domain and property seizures that kept me awake at night. I tried reasoning with her like a civilized neighbor. She laughed in my face. I showed historical documentation proving protected status. She ignored every piece of evidence. I cited tree protection ordinances backed by county authority. She claimed emergency powers that didn't exist. What Barbara didn't know. I'd spent 34 years researching plant biology and environmental law, and I'd just discovered something very interesting about who actually owned the land under that oak tree. One strategically filed heritage preservation claim later. Federal investigation, criminal charges, environmental crimes, public humiliation. But that's just the beginning of how this power-hungry HOA president learned that some trees have roots deeper than her corruption. Tell me in the comments, would you fight to save a tree with this much history? Drop a flag emoji below and let me know where you're watching from, because this story gets absolutely wild. Let me tell you about the American dream that almost died under a chainsaw. I'm Sarah Micho, 58 years old, retired botany professor who'd spent 3 decades teaching plant biology at the State University. My specialty, understanding how root systems create networks that survive for centuries through interconnected mycorrhizal fungi, how ancient trees communicate chemical signals through underground networks, how ecosystems depend on keystone species that seem ordinary until you remove them and watch everything collapse like dominoes. After 34 years of academic research and teaching hundreds of students, I'd taken early retirement when my husband James died suddenly from a massive heart attack 3 years ago. Our oak tree became my sanctuary, the living witness to 32 years of marriage, the place where grief and memory intertwined like roots and soil. The heritage oak stood magnificently in our front yard in Riverside Meadows, a majestic Quercus alba specimen estimated at 150 years old based on core samples I'd taken with proper county permits. Its massive canopy spread 82 feet across, providing shade and cooling for 3 neighboring properties during brutal summer months. The trunk measured 9 feet in circumference at breast height, indicating decades of slow, steady growth. Every spring, it produced thousands of acorns feeding local wildlife populations. Every summer, children played in its shade during scorching afternoons. Every fall, its leaves created a carpet of gold and crimson that neighbors photographed like art. And 32 years ago, James had proposed to meet under those branches during an autumn sunset, the light filtering through leaves like stained glass windows in a cathedral. Have you ever had a place so meaningful that losing it would break something fundamental in your soul? That's what this tree meant to me. Write in the comments if you've ever fought to protect something irreplaceable, because you're going to want to remember this feeling. Then Barbara Mitchell decided my tree violated her vision of suburban uniformity and modern landscaping perfection. Picture your worst HOA nightmare. Then add a law degree, multiply by environmental destruction. And you've got Barbara. She was 56, with silver hair, styled like a corporate executive, and an attitude that could kill houseplants through pure toxic energy. She lived in Riverside Meadows' largest modern mansion, all glass and concrete and aggressive landscaping that required industrial amounts of water and pesticides that probably violated environmental regulations themselves. Her husband Gerald owned Mitchell Development Corporation, which had built half the subdivision back in 2015 when farmland was converted to suburban sprawl. She served as HOA president with the license plate Queen Bee, because apparently irony was dead in her world. She drove a white Mercedes GLS with windows tinted so dark they probably violated laws, and she treated HOA regulations like biblical commandments handed down from her personal mountain. The first violation notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by certified mail, that required my signature, like I was accepting a declaration of war against my family's history. Crisp white paper with the HOA logo embossed in fake gold that probably cost more than the paper deserved. Property tree in violation of Article 12, Section 7. Large vegetation creating sightline obstruction, root damage to community infrastructure, and aesthetic inconsistency with modern landscaping standards. Immediate removal required within 60 days to avoid escalating fines and potential property liens. I read that notice 3 times, my hands shaking with rage that threatened to overwhelm my scientific training. Sightline obstruction. My oak had been standing there for 150 years. The street was built around it in 2015. Root damage to infrastructure. I'd personally surveyed the root system using ground-penetrating radar. Not a single pipe or cable ran within 20 feet of the trunk. Aesthetic inconsistency. This was a heritage tree, protected under county environmental ordinances that superseded HOA authority. So I walked over to Barbara's glass palace like a civilized human being, carrying my research documentation and county permits in a professional folder. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Sarah Mitchell. We met at the neighborhood welcoming party 3 years ago. I received this violation notice about my oak tree, but there's been a significant misunderstanding. That tree is protected under county heritage tree ordinances and multiple environmental regulations. Barbara opened her massive front door with a predator's smile that reminded me of carnivorous plants I'd studied. Oh, Dr. Mitchell, there's no misunderstanding whatsoever. The HOA board voted unanimously to require removal of all pre-existing vegetation that doesn't meet current landscaping standards. Your tree is the first on our neighborhood improvement list. The way she said improvement made it sound like she was discussing exterminating vermin instead of destroying a living piece of history. Ma'am, this tree is 150 years old. It's a heritage specimen with documented historical significance. I have official documentation from the County Environmental Office confirming protected status under multiple ordinances. Her eyes went cold like she was calculating property values rather than considering ecological or historical significance. Dr. Mitchell, HOA regulations supersede county ordinances within our jurisdiction. The board has determined your tree constitutes both a hazard and aesthetic violation. You have 60 days to arrange professional removal at your expense, or the HOA will arrange removal and bill you for costs plus administrative fees. I'd estimate approximately $12,000 total if we have to handle it ourselves. The threat was clear as spring water and twice as cold. Pay to destroy my own tree, or pay even more to have Barbara destroy it for me. Walking back home, my shoes crunched on acorns scattered across my lawn, each one containing the genetic legacy of 150 years of growth and survival. That night, I pulled out my university research files, my environmental law textbooks that James had helped me acquire, and my husband's memory box. James had been a civil rights attorney, specializing in property rights cases before his sudden death. His files contained extensive research about HOA overreach and governmental authority, about how homeowner associations couldn't violate state and federal environmental protections, about precedent cases where heritage tree ordinances had defeated HOA regulations. I spent that entire night reading by lamplight, taking methodical notes like I was preparing for the most important lecture of my entire academic career. Because I was about to teach Barbara Mitchell a fundamental lesson about ecosystems, about how removing a keystone species creates catastrophic cascade failures throughout entire systems. 34 years of botany research had taught me something Barbara clearly didn't understand. Trees are patient. Trees are incredibly strong. And trees always grow toward the light, even when surrounded by darkness. And this particular tree had a botanist who knew exactly how to document environmental crimes with scientific precision. You know what 3 decades of university research teaches you? How to conduct systematic investigation and build absolutely irrefutable cases based on peer-reviewed evidence. That weekend, I made my first strategic move. At County Environmental Office, I requested copies of all heritage tree documentation. historical surveys, and environmental protection ordinances for Riverside Meadows dating back to 1990. If Barbara wanted to play the documentation game, she'd just challenged someone whose entire career was built on peer-reviewed research and evidence-based conclusions that could withstand academic scrutiny. I spent Saturday and Sunday cross-referencing documents at my kitchen table. The historical surveys revealed something extraordinary that made my researcher heart race. My oak wasn't just old and beautiful. It was historically significant in ways Barbara couldn't imagine. County records from 1870 showed this exact tree marked as a boundary marker between two original land grant properties. Native American archaeological surveys from 1962 identified it as a landmark tree that local tribes had used for generations. Environmental surveys from 1995 listed it as critical habitat for 3 protected bird species, and the County Heritage Tree Registry from 2008 officially designated it as Protected Heritage Specimen Number O-473, with legal protections that superseded local HOA regulations. Barbara had just declared war on a tree that had more legal protection than most historical buildings in our county. Wait until you hear what I discovered next, because this is where things get absolutely insane. Monday morning, I filed a formal appeal with the HOA board citing specific county ordinances, state environmental protections, and Federal Endangered Species Act provisions related to the protected bird species nesting in my tree. 43 pages of single-spaced documentation with 62 attached exhibits, including photographs of active bird nests, soil surveys showing root system placement far from infrastructure, and historical records proving the tree's protected status. Tuesday brought Barbara's response. A single paragraph dismissing everything as irrelevant because HOA authority was supposedly absolute within subdivision boundaries. Have any of you dealt with someone so convinced of their power that they ignore actual laws? Drop a comment about your experience, because you're going to want to remember this moment. Wednesday, I contacted Dr. Ramon Foster from the State University's Environmental Law Clinic, where I'd served as consulting expert on previous cases. "Sarah," he said over coffee at our old campus haunt, where we'd discussed countless research projects. "This is one of the clearest cases of HOA overreach I've seen in 20 years. Your tree has triple-layer protection, county heritage designation, state environmental protection, and federal wildlife habitat. If Barbara tries to cut this tree, she's not just violating HOA procedures. She's committing multiple environmental crimes with potential federal penalties, including substantial fines and possible imprisonment." Thursday morning, 7:45 a.m. sharp, Barbara showed up at my front door with a clipboard, a professional camera, and that predatory smile that made every botanical instinct in my body scream danger. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm conducting an official HOA property assessment. I need to photograph your tree from multiple angles and document the alleged root damage to community infrastructure." Barbara walked around my oak, taking hundreds of photos like she was documenting evidence for prosecution. "This tree is clearly causing street cracking," she announced, pointing to normal settling cracks that had nothing to do with roots, "and these low branches create visibility hazards for traffic. Ma'am, those pavement cracks are from normal thermal expansion and poor initial construction, and those branches are 15 feet above street level." Her laugh could have withered houseplants. "Dr. Mitchell, I don't need a botany lecture from you. I need compliance with HOA regulations. You have 47 days remaining before we proceed with removal authorization, whether you consent or not." I pulled out my phone and opened my documentation file. "Mrs. Mitchell, before you proceed any further, you should know that this tree is protected heritage specimen O-473, provides critical habitat for federally protected bird species, and has been designated historically significant. Cutting this tree would constitute multiple environmental crimes at county, state, and federal levels. Any of you ever seen someone's face when they realize they're about to commit serious crimes?" Because Barbara's expression was absolutely priceless. The pause was longer than a tree's growing season. Actually, violation notices imply nothing about consent. I've already filed appeals with appropriate authorities and retained environmental legal counsel. Any attempt to remove this tree will result in immediate legal action, including personal liability for environmental damage and civil rights violations under color of law. That night, I started investigating Barbara Mitchell's HOA enforcement history using research methodology I'd perfected over 34 years. The county assessor's office had public records of every property transaction in Riverside Meadows for 10 years. I requested copies of all HOA enforcement actions since Barbara became president 8 years ago. What I discovered made my hands shake with scientific excitement and moral outrage. Barbara hadn't just been enforcing landscaping standards fairly. She'd been systematically targeting properties for tree removal that coincidentally sat on land her husband wanted to develop. 8 families had been forced to remove mature trees over 7 years for alleged violations. 6 of those families subsequently sold their properties under distress conditions. 5 were purchased by shell companies I traced back to Mitchell Development Corporation through public records. The pattern was clear. Barbara would target properties with valuable mature trees, force removal through manufactured violations. Then Gerald's company would buy distressed properties cheaply, clear-cut everything, build McMansions, and sell for massive profits. My heritage oak was being targeted because my corner lot was worth potentially $600,000 to developers, but only if the tree was gone and the property could be subdivided. This wasn't HOA enforcement for community benefit. This was systematic property theft disguised as landscaping standards. Want to know what happened when I took this evidence to the authorities? Smash that subscribe button because part 2 is going to blow your mind. The HOA meeting Thursday evening brought 17 concerned residents who filled chairs. Barbara sat at the head table flanked by 4 uncomfortable committee members. I stood with my research binder. Madam President, I'm appealing this violation because it represents fundamental misapplication of HOA authority over environmentally protected trees and a pattern of systematic property manipulation for private development profit. I projected maps showing forced tree removals, subsequent property sales, and Mitchell Development Corporation acquisitions over 7 years. The collective gasp was audible. Tell me in the comments, have you ever uncovered corruption this deep? 8 properties had lost an average of $73,000 after forced tree removals, then were purchased by shell companies for 32% below market value. Committee member Patricia Reynolds raised her hand. Barbara, did you review the heritage tree protection status before issuing this violation? Barbara's response was pure deflection. The committee voted to update enforcement standards. For 8 years, Barbara Mitchell has been using her position to target properties with valuable trees, force removal, create distressed sales, and enable her husband's company to acquire properties at below-market prices. This is racketeering. This is systematic property manipulation. This is environmental crime for profit. The room erupted. Barbara's gavel came down with fury. This meeting is adjourned immediately. Walking out, neighbors stopped me with stories. Sarah, the Johnsons were forced to remove their maple 4 years ago. They sold 6 months later. I realized Barbara hadn't just targeted my tree. She'd terrorized an entire community. Have you ever had to fight to protect your neighborhood from corruption? Comment below, because part 2 reveals how spectacularly this collapsed. The Heritage Oak War. How HOA President Barbara Mitchell learned that some roots run deeper than property lines. Part 2, Barbara's threat about difficult consequences, wasn't just empty words. It was a declaration of total war against anyone who dared expose her criminal enterprise. And like most desperate people backed into a corner by irrefutable evidence, she was about to make the kind of catastrophic mistakes that turn property disputes into federal environmental crimes. What Barbara didn't understand about botanists is that we're trained to observe patterns, document changes, and recognize when ecosystems are being deliberately destroyed. And I was about to apply 34 years of scientific methodology to her entire operation. Drop a comment if you've ever had to fight back against someone who thought they were untouchable. The morning after that explosive HOA meeting, I woke to find spray paint across my oak tree's trunk. Bright orange letters, spelling hazard, and remove in aggressive capital letters that dripped down the ancient bark like toxic blood. The chemical smell of aerosol paint burned my nostrils as I stood there in my bathrobe at 6:30 a.m., photographing the vandalism with trembling hands. My security cameras, which I'd installed after James died, captured everything in perfect detail. 3:27 a.m. A white Mercedes GLS with distinctive license plate Queen B pulled up to my curb. Barbara Mitchell emerged wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap, carrying 2 cans of spray paint like weapons. For nearly 8 minutes, she defaced a federally protected heritage tree, while muttering angrily to herself. The footage even caught her face clearly when she looked directly at one of my cameras and smiled. Have you ever watched someone commit a crime while knowing they're being recorded? That level of arrogance is genuinely terrifying. I called the county sheriff's office at 7 a.m. with the same calm precision I'd used reporting research findings to academic journals. Deputy Lisa Martinez arrived 45 minutes later, her patrol car's radio crackling with morning dispatch traffic. Dr. Mitchell, this is pretty clear-cut vandalism and environmental damage to protected property. We'll need your security footage for the report. I handed her a USB drive ID prepared with 4 camera angles, timestamps, synchronized, and a written summary of the tree's protected status under county, state, and federal regulations. My decades of academic training had taught me that documentation quality determines investigation outcomes. Deputy Martinez watched the footage on her laptop right there in my driveway, her expression shifting from professional interest to visible shock. That's Barbara Mitchell, the HOA president, with her license plate visible and everything? Yes, ma'am. That's her vehicle, her distinctive plates, and her face in clear view at timestamp 3:32 a.m. when she looks directly at the camera. The deputy's radio crackled with a call about a traffic incident, but she held up one finger to dispatch. Ma'am, I need to ask, have you been having ongoing disputes with Mrs. Mitchell? I pulled out my documentation binder, now expanded to include last night's meeting, evidence, and witness statements from 17 residents. Deputy, I've been documenting 8 months of escalating harassment, including illegal violation notices for federally protected trees, threats of property seizure, systematic property manipulation for development profit, and now vandalism of protected heritage specimens. This spray paint attack is just the latest escalation in a pattern of environmental crimes and property fraud. Deputy Martinez looked at my binder like it was evidence from a major organized crime investigation. Most folks just file simple vandalism reports. You've got easily 300 pages here with scientific analysis, legal citations, and financial documentation. Dr. Mitchell, I think you need to contact both County Environmental Enforcement and possibly the FBI's Environmental Crimes Unit. That afternoon, I drove to County Environmental Protection Agency with my evidence files carefully organized in banker's boxers. The building smelled like government offices and righteous bureaucracy. Environmental Enforcement Officer James Chun reviewed my documentation with the intensity of a scientist reviewing groundbreaking research. Dr. Mitchell, he said after 2 hours of examination, this isn't just HOA overreach. This is systematic environmental crime for financial gain. You've documented patterned destruction of protected trees, falsification of safety reports to justify removal, property manipulation schemes, and now vandalism of federally protected specimens. We're looking at potential violations of the Environmental Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, heritage tree ordinances, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I need to forward this to our Criminal Investigation Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office immediately. But the real bombshell came when I showed him the spray paint chemical analysis I'd conducted in my home laboratory that morning. Being a botanist with access to university equipment has advantages. The orange paint contained toxins specifically harmful to oak trees, including systemic herbicides designed to be absorbed through bark. This wasn't just vandalism for intimidation. This was an attempted murder of a 150-year-old tree using chemical weapons. Tell me in the comments, does anyone else think this is absolutely psychotic behavior? Because what Barbara did next makes the spray paint look like amateur hour. Wednesday afternoon, I'm in my backyard collecting soil samples near the Oaks root zone when I hear the unmistakable diesel rumble of heavy equipment. I rushed to the front yard to find a tree removal company's massive truck parked in front of my house. 2 workers approaching my oak with climbing gear and chainsaws. The smell of diesel exhaust, mixed with the sweet scent of oak leaves, created a surreal atmosphere of impending disaster. "What the hell is going on?" I shouted, running toward them. The crew chief, a weathered man in his 50s, held up a work order. "Ma'am, we've got an HOA authorization to remove this tree. Emergency hazard removal, all permits approved, scheduled for today." I snatched the work order from his hands. "This is fraudulent. This tree is protected under federal law. There are no valid permits for removal. You touch one branch, and you'll be personally liable for environmental crimes." The crew chief pulled out his phone and called his office, while I simultaneously called Deputy Martinez, Environmental Officer Chun, and Dr. Foster from the University Law Clinic. Within 20 minutes, my front yard looked like a crime scene with 2 sheriff's vehicles, an environmental enforcement truck, and a very confused tree removal crew. Officer Chun examined the work order with forensic attention. "This authorization is signed by Barbara Mitchell as HOA President, but there are no actual county permits attached. The environmental review section is completely blank. The federal habitat assessment is missing entirely. This is a fraudulent work order. If you'd cut this tree based on this document, your company would have faced federal prosecution and millions in fines." The crew chief went pale. "We do hundreds of HOA jobs every year. We trust the paperwork. We had no idea this was protected. Do you have any idea how often HOA presidents fake permits to remove trees they don't like? Write your experiences in the comments, because this happens way more than people realize." Officer Chun turned to Deputy Martinez with grim determination. "We need to file formal charges immediately. Attempted destruction of federally protected habitat, falsification of government documents, conspiracy to commit environmental crimes. This has escalated beyond local vandalism. I'm requesting federal involvement." That evening, I received a phone call that changed everything. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Special Agent Patricia Morrison from the FBI's Environmental Crimes Task Force. We've reviewed the documentation you provided to county authorities. We'd like to meet tomorrow to discuss opening a federal investigation into organized environmental crime and property fraud in your HOA. The official tone of her voice carried weight that made my academic achievements feel small by comparison. This wasn't just about my tree anymore. This had become a federal case. The FBI meeting Friday morning took place in a nondescript office building that smelled like coffee and serious consequences. Special Agent Morrison sat across from me with 2 other agents, and a federal prosecutor named David Kim. The walls were covered with maps and evidence boards from other environmental crime cases. "Dr. Mitchell," Agent Morrison began, spreading my documentation across a conference table. "What you've compiled here is extraordinary. In 22 years, investigating environmental crimes, I've never seen a civilian investigation this thorough. You've essentially done our job for us. You've documented systematic tree removal targeting valuable properties, financial transactions showing property manipulation, shell company structures hiding development schemes, falsified environmental assessments, and now attempted destruction of federally protected habitat using fraudulent permits. This is racketeering. This is organized crime, disguised as suburban HOA governance." Federal Prosecutor Kim leaned forward with the focused attention of someone building a major case. "The charges we're considering are substantial: conspiracy to violate the Endangered Species Act, falsification of government documents, wire fraud related to property transactions, environmental destruction for financial gain, and potentially RICO violations if we can prove ongoing criminal enterprise. Mrs. Mitchell and her husband are looking at potential federal prison sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years, plus massive restitution and fines. But we need your continued cooperation as a witness and scientific expert." My botanist training kicked in. "What do you need from me?" "Everything you have, plus testimony about the tree's ecological significance, documentation of the systematic pattern, and expert witness testimony about the environmental damage. We're also going to need you to wear a wire during your next interaction with Barbara Mitchell. Have any of you ever been asked to become an FBI informant? Because, let me tell you, It's simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. The setup happened Tuesday afternoon. I called Barbara requesting a meeting to discuss settlement options, knowing she'd jump at the chance to intimidate me into submission. We met at a neutral coffee shop downtown, one that happened to have excellent acoustics for the recording device hidden in my purse. Barbara arrived in full power suit glory, red blazer and red glasses, practically screaming authority and entitlement. Dr. Mitchell, she began with false sweetness that fooled nobody. I'm glad you've finally come to your senses about this ridiculous tree situation. I smiled with the calm confidence of someone working with federal agents. Actually, Barbara, I wanted to discuss your systematic targeting of properties for tree removal over the past 8 years. The pattern of forced removals, distressed sales, and acquisitions by your husband's shell companies. Her face went through rapid emotional changes that my recorder captured perfectly. I don't know what you think you've discovered, but you're way out of your depth here. Those were legitimate HOA enforcement actions. If property owners chose to sell afterward, that's market forces, not manipulation. I pulled out printed spreadsheets showing the financial patterns. 8 families forced to remove mature trees. 6 subsequent distressed sales. 5 purchases by companies traced to Micho Development Corporation. Average profit per property, $214,000. Total profit over 7 years. Approximately $1.7 million from systematic environmental destruction and property manipulation. The color drained from Barbara's face. You can't prove any connection between HOA enforcement and property sales. That's circumstantial nonsense. Actually, I have emails between you and Gerald discussing specific properties to target. I have bank records showing shell company transactions. I have testimony from families you terrorized. And I have federal agents very interested in your fraudulent permit for my tree removal. That's when Barbara made her fatal mistake, the one that would seal her fate and prove every allegation. She leaned forward with pure venom in her voice. You, self-righteous, academic bitch, you think your little tree and your research papers make you special. I've been running this neighborhood for 8 years, and I'll be running it long after you're gone. That tree is coming down one way or another. If the HOA can't do it legally, there are other ways to eliminate problems. Accidents happen. Old trees fall during storms. Mysterious fires, damaged roots. You should be very, very careful about what happens to your precious oak in the middle of the night. The recording device captured every word of her threatening environmental destruction and personal harm. Tell your followers in the comments if they think this is insane, because it gets even worse. I stood up calmly, my hands surprisingly steady. Barbara, I think we're done here. You've made your position very clear. As I walked out of that coffee shop, Agent Morrison was already listening to the live feed from her surveillance van. We've got her on tape threatening environmental destruction and witness intimidation. Combined with the fraudulent permit, the spray paint vandalism, and the pattern evidence, we have enough for federal arrest warrants. The next 48 hours moved with the precision of a military operation. Federal agents conducted simultaneous raids on Barbara and Gerald's mansion, Mitchell Development Corporation offices, HOA management offices, and the offices of every shell company connected to their property schemes. The local news caught footage of FBI agents carrying boxes of evidence out of Barbara's glass palace while she screamed about persecution and illegal searches. Her perfectly styled silver hair looked decidedly less presidential under the harsh glare of television cameras and federal investigation spotlights. The arrest came on a Thursday morning, 8 days after my explosive HOA meeting. Barbara was taken into custody at her weekly hair appointment, handcuffed in front of the same salon where she'd held court for years as neighborhood queen. Her red blazer and red glasses became symbols of corruption rather than authority. Gerald was arrested at his Development Corporation headquarters, led out past employees and clients who'd trusted him with their property dreams. The charges read like an environmental crime encyclopedia: conspiracy to violate the Endangered Species Act, falsification of federal documents, wire fraud, environmental destruction for profit, witness intimidation, and criminal conspiracy. The federal prosecutor announced 8 to 15 years potential prison time plus millions in restitution. But what happened next shocked everyone. When FBI agents searched the Mitchell mansion, They found Barbara's private files containing detailed records of 23 families she'd targeted over 8 years, not just the 8 I'd documented. Each file contained photographs of mature trees, property value assessments, development potential calculations, and strategic plans for forest removal. She'd been running an environmental crime syndicate from her HOA President office, systematically destroying protected trees and manipulating properties for profit while pretending to enforce community standards. The total estimated profit, approximately $4.2 million from environmental destruction and property fraud. Would you fight to expose corruption this massive? Hit that subscribe button because Part 3 reveals the trial, the sentencing, and how our community rebuilt after Barbara's reign of environmental terror ended. The Heretai Oak War. How HOA President Barbara Mitchell learned that some roots run deeper than property lines. Part 3. The federal trial began on a crisp Monday morning in October, exactly 6 months after Barbara's arrest. The courthouse smelled like polished wood and inevitable justice, with October sunlight streaming through tall windows, creating dramatic lighting for what was about to become the most significant environmental crime trial in our county's history. I sat in the front row of the gallery with 23 other families who'd been victimized by Barbara's systematic environmental destruction scheme, all of us waiting to see justice measured in years and acres of destroyed habitat. The prosecution had spent 6 months building an absolutely bulletproof case, and today we'd finally watch Barbara Mitchell face consequences for treating protected trees like obstacles to profit. Barbara entered the courtroom wearing a conservative navy suit instead of her signature red blazer, clearly coached by expensive attorneys to look less authoritative and more sympathetic. But 6 months in federal detention awaiting trial had transformed her from entitled HOA queen to desperate defendant. Her silver hair, once styled weakly with precision, now showed gray roots and hung limp around her face. The red glasses were gone, replaced by plain frames that screamed, "We're trying to make her look harmless." Gerald sat beside her at the defense table in an equally expensive suit, his developer confidence replaced by the haunted expression of someone watching their entire empire collapse. Their lead attorney, Marcus Sullivan, from a prestigious environmental law firm, had the unenviable task of defending clients caught on camera, on recording, and in written documents committing multiple federal crimes. Have you ever watched someone try to defend the indefensible? Drop a comment about the worst excuse you've ever heard, because Barbara's defense strategy was absolutely wild. Federal Judge Patricia Chun entered with the measured authority of someone who'd presided over environmental cases for 28 years. "Before we begin jury selection," Judge Chun announced, "I want to address the scope of this trial. We are here to determine whether the defendants engaged in systematic environmental crimes, property fraud, and witness intimidation over an 80-year period. This is not a simple HOA dispute. This is about whether individuals can use positions of authority to destroy federally protected habitats for personal financial gain." The jury of 12 citizens was selected over 3 intense days, 6 women, 6 men, representing various backgrounds and professions. A retired teacher, a small business owner, an engineer, a nurse, a construction contractor, an accountant. Each one would hear evidence that would make them question how such crimes could happen in suburban America. Tell me in the comments, would you want to serve on a jury for a case like this? Federal prosecutor David Kim delivered his opening statement with the precision of a botanist identifying species. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the next 3 weeks, you will hear evidence of an organized criminal enterprise that operated under the cover of Homeowner Association authority. You will see documentation of 23 families systematically targeted for tree removal. You will hear testimony from environmental experts about the irreplaceable ecological value of century-old trees. You will watch security footage of the defendant vandalizing federally protected specimens with herbicidal paint. You will listen to recordings of the defendant threatening environmental destruction and witness intimidation. And you will examine financial records showing approximately $4.2 million in profits from properties acquired through environmental destruction and manipulation. This is not about HOA regulations. This is about greed, power, and the systematic destruction of irreplaceable natural heritage for profit. The defense attorney's opening statement tried to paint Barbara as a dedicated volunteer, overwhelmed by difficult property management decisions. But his argument started crumbling immediately when Prosecutor Kim called his first witness. Me? Dr. Sarah Mitchell. The prosecutor began as I took the witness stand with my hand on a Bible I'd carried since James's funeral. Please tell the jury about your professional background. I spent 34 years as a botany professor at State University, specializing in tree biology, root systems, and ecosystem relationships. I've published 73 peer-reviewed papers on plant biology and served as expert witness in 12 previous environmental cases. My testimony credentials were designed to establish that I knew exactly what I was talking about when it came to trees and environmental law. Now, Dr. Mitchell, please explain to the jury the ecological significance of a 150-year-old oak tree. Have any of you ever had to explain something complex to people who might not understand? Comment below, because this moment was crucial. I turned to address the jury directly, channeling 3 decades of teaching experience. A 150-year-old heritage oak isn't just a tree. It's a keystone species that supports entire ecosystems. The root system extends underground, roughly equal to the canopy spread. In this case, approximately 82 feet in all directions, creating networks that prevent erosion, filter water, and support beneficial fungi. The canopy provides habitat for dozens of bird species, including 3 federally protected species in my tree's case. A mature oak produces thousands of acorns annually, feeding wildlife populations. It sequesters approximately 48 pounds of carbon dioxide per year. It provides cooling equivalent to 10-room air conditioners running 20 hours per day. When you destroy a 150-year-old tree, you're not removing a landscaping element. You're collapsing an ecosystem that took a century and a half to develop and can never be replaced in our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes. The prosecutor projected photographs of my oak tree on courtroom monitors. Dr. Mitchell, is this the tree that Barbara Mitchell ordered removed? Yes. That tree was alive when the Civil War ended. It witnessed the Industrial Revolution to world wars, the space age. It provided shade for 4 generations of my family. My husband proposed to me under those branches. It's where he took his last walk before his heart attack. That tree isn't property to me. It's family. Several jurors visibly reacted to the emotional testimony. Then the prosecutor played the security footage of Barbara spray painting my tree at 3:27 a.m. Dr. Mitchell, what was in that spray paint? I conducted chemical analysis in my laboratory. The orange paint contained systemic herbicides, specifically designed to be absorbed through bark and kill oak trees from the inside. This wasn't vandalism for intimidation. This was attempted murder of a federally protected organism, using chemical weapons. The courtroom gasped. The defense attorney objected strenuously, but Judge Chun allowed the testimony as relevant scientific analysis from a qualified expert. Day 3 brought the most devastating evidence. The recording of Barbara threatening me in the coffee shop. The prosecutor played the audio through courtroom speakers, Barbara's voice crystal clear and dripping with venom. That tree is coming down one way or another. If the HOA can't do it legally, there are other ways to eliminate problems. Accidents happen. Old trees fall during storms. Mysterious fires damage roots. You should be very careful about what happens to your precious oak in the middle of the night. The jury's expressions shifted from curiosity to visible condemnation. This wasn't alleged environmental crime. This was recorded conspiracy to destroy federal protected habitat and threaten a witness. Tell your followers in the comments if they think threatening to murder a 150-year-old tree is psychotic behavior, because the jury clearly thought so. But the prosecution's most powerful witnesses were the 23 families Barbara had targeted over 8 years. One by one, they testified about systematic harassment, forced tree removals, property value losses, and distressed sales that benefited Mitchell Development Corporation. Margaret and Tom Henderson testified about the 200-year-old maple tree they'd been forced to remove in 2017. Barbara issued violation notices, claiming the tree created liability risks. She testified, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. We spent $14,000 fighting her through appeals. We lost. We had to cut down a tree that had been on that property since before our house was built. 6 months later, we sold our home for $87,000 less than assessed value, because without that tree, the property had no shade, and the cooling costs were unbearable. Mitchell Development Corporation bought it through a shell company for 32% below market value. Within a year, they'd built a McMansion and sold it for $260,000 profit. Our tree wasn't a violation. It was an obstacle to their profit margin. The Martinez family testified about losing their heritage walnut grove in 2019. Barbara claimed the trees violated setback requirements that didn't exist when our property was built. Roberta Martinez explained, fighting back tears. She threatened Leanne's foreclosure, legal action that would bankrupt us. "We're immigrants. We were terrified of losing everything. We cut down 8 walnut trees that my grandfather planted in 19... trees that connected us to our family history and our homeland. 4 months later, we sold because we couldn't bear to live there without those trees. Mitchell Development bought our property for 43% below market value. The systematic nature of Barbara's crimes became undeniable as family after family told nearly identical stories of harassment, forced removal, and property manipulation. How many of you have lost something irreplaceable to corruption? Share your stories in the comments, because these families' pain was absolutely real. Day 7 brought FBI forensic accountant Linda Rodriguez, who'd spent 5 months analyzing 8 years of financial records. The numbers tell an absolutely clear story of organized environmental crime for profit. Linda testified, her laser pointer tracing money flows on projected spreadsheets that filled the courtroom monitors. Barbara Mitchell would identify properties with valuable mature trees. She'd issue HOA violations requiring removal. Property owners would spend thousands fighting her, lose, be forced to remove trees, then sell at distressed prices due to reduced property values. Shell companies, controlled by Mitchell Development Corporation, would purchase these distressed properties at an average of 37% below market value. They'd clear-cut remaining vegetation, build modern houses, and resell at massive profits. Total documented profit over 8 years, $4.2 million from 23 properties. The defense attorney attempted damage control. Isn't it possible these were legitimate HOA enforcement actions and the property sales were coincidental market forces? Linda's response was devastating. Sir, legitimate enforcement doesn't target only properties with development potential. Coincidence doesn't follow this precise a pattern across 23 separate transactions over 8 years. And market forces don't involve the HOA president's husband's company buying every single distressed property through shell companies. This is systematic environmental crime and property fraud, not coincidence. Day 9 brought the environmental impact testimony that made several jurors visibly emotional. Dr. Raymond Foster from the State University explained how destroying mature trees damages entire ecosystems. When you remove a 150-year-old tree, you're eliminating habitat for hundreds of species. You're disrupting water filtration systems. You're removing carbon sequestration. You're destroying cooling systems that took generations to develop. Barbara Mitchell didn't just commit property fraud. She committed environmental destruction that will take 200 years to restore. If it can be restored at all, some ecosystems, once destroyed, never fully recover. The 23 trees she forced people to remove represented approximately 3,400 years of combined growth. That's irreplaceable natural heritage destroyed for profit. Tell me in the comments, should environmental destruction carry the same penalties as other serious crimes? Because the jury was clearly asking themselves that question. Day 12 brought Barbara's defense testimony, and it was a masterclass in denial and deflection. Marcus Sullivan walked her through a carefully rehearsed narrative about being a dedicated volunteer, trying to protect property values and community safety. But everything fell apart during cross-examination. Mrs. Mitchell, Prosecutor Kim began, you testified that tree removals were safety decisions. Can you explain why you never ordered safety inspections by certified arborists? Barbara hesitated. The HOA board made collective decisions based on visual assessments. So you, with no botanical training, determined that 150-year-old heritage trees were hazards without professional evaluation. We were protecting the community, and that protection coincidentally targeted properties your husband wanted to develop. The properties that were purchased through your husband's shell companies. That's not what happened. We have financial records showing direct connections. We have your personal files documenting 23 target properties with development calculations. We have recordings of you threatening environmental destruction. How do you explain this evidence? Barbera's voice rose with desperation. This is a conspiracy by bitter residents who couldn't follow simple rules. Judge Chun interrupted sharply. Mrs. Mitchell answered the question directly. Do you deny that properties you targeted for tree removal were subsequently purchased by companies owned by your husband? The pause was longer than a tree's growing season. I don't recall the specific details of every property transaction. You don't recall making $4.2 million from properties where you forced tree removals. Her attorney jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. Prosecutor Kim is badgering the witness. Judge Chun's expression could have frozen plant growth. Overruled. Mrs. Mitchell opened this line of testimony. She will answer the question. Barbera's final response sealed her fate. Some property transactions may have involved companies my husband works with, but I never directly coordinated HOA enforcement with development opportunities. That would be illegal. The irony of her last sentence wasn't lost on anyone. Have you ever watched someone accidentally confess while trying to deny guilt? Comment below, because Barbara essentially admitted coordination while claiming she never coordinated. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. When they returned Wednesday afternoon, the courtroom fell silent as everyone stood for their entrance. The jury foreman, a retired engineer who'd taken meticulous notes throughout the trial, stood with the verdict forms. On count 1, conspiracy to violate the Endangered Species Act. How do you find? We find the defendant, Barbara Mitchell, guilty. On count 2, falsification of federal documents. How do you find? We find the defendant, Barbara Mitchell, guilty. The guilty verdicts continued through all 17 counts. Environmental destruction for profit. Wire fraud. Witness intimidation. Conspiracy to commit property fraud. Barbara's face remained frozen in disbelief as each verdict landed like a tree falling. When the final count was read, she turned to Gerald with pure venom. This is your fault. Your greedy development schemes destroyed everything. But Gerald had no response except silent tears that spoke of a man watching his marriage, his business, and his freedom collapse simultaneously. Judge Chun scheduled sentencing for 4 weeks later and remanded both defendants to continued federal custody. As marshals led Barbara away, she managed one final desperate scream. That tree should be cut down. It's just a tree. Her complete inability to understand why destroying irreplaceable natural heritage for profit was wrong only confirmed every allegation against her. Walking out of that courthouse into the crisp October afternoon, surrounded by 23 families who'd finally received justice after years of environmental terrorism, felt like watching an invasive species being removed from a threatened ecosystem. Mrs. Henderson hugged me with tears streaming down her face. Sarah, we can never get our maple tree back. But at least Barbara can never destroy another family's trees. She'll be 71 years old when she gets out of prison. The Martinez family invited everyone to a celebration that felt more like a memorial service for lost trees and a birth announcement for community healing. That evening, 47 Riverside Meadows residents gathered in the community center, no longer afraid of HOA retaliation, finally free to speak openly about the environmental crimes they'd witnessed. And my 150-year-old oak tree stood tall in my front yard, its fall leaves turning gold and crimson, a living witness to the truth that some roots run deeper than corruption, and some ecosystems are worth fighting to protect. Would you fight this hard to save irreplaceable natural heritage? Hit that subscribe button because Part 4 reveals the sentencing, the restitution, and how our community transformed environmental tragedy into lasting protection for every tree in our neighborhood. The Heritage Oak War. How HOA President Barbara Mitchell Learned That Some Roots Run Deeper Than Property Lines, Part 4, Final. The sentencing hearing for weeks after the guilty verdicts felt like watching nature reclaim territory from an invasive species that had poisoned the ecosystem for far too long. The same federal courthouse, the same courtroom where Barbara's conviction had been delivered. But this time the atmosphere carried the weight of finality rather than anticipation of justice. I sat in the front row with the same 23 families who'd testified at trial, all of us waiting to see justice measured in years, dollars, and permanent consequences that would echo through generations. Judge Patricia Chun entered carrying sentencing guidelines and victim impact statements that would determine the rest of Barbara Mitchell's life, and possibly set precedent for how environmental crimes would be punished in our judicial system. Barbara entered wearing the same conservative navy suit instead of her signature red blazer. But 4 weeks of federal custody after conviction had transformed her from defiant defendant to broken criminal facing irreversible consequences. Her silver hair hung completely gray and unkempt, no longer styled with the precision she'd maintained during her 8 years as HOA tyrant. The confident HOA president who'd terrorized our neighborhood was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood that some consequences are irreversible, regardless of money or connections. Gerald shuffled in behind her, his developer confidence completely shattered by conviction on 12 counts. Their expensive attorneys looked like they'd rather be anywhere else except defending clients who'd been caught committing environmental crimes on camera, on recording, and in written documentation. Have you ever watched someone face the full weight of justice after years of believing they were untouchable? Comment below about karma catching up, because this moment was absolutely profound in its demonstration of accountability. Before we proceed with sentencing, Judge Chun began, her voice carrying the weight of 28 years of environmental law experience. I want to address the extraordinary nature of these crimes that goes beyond typical property disputes or even ordinary fraud. This case involved systematic destruction of irreplaceable natural heritage over 8 years of coordinated criminal activity. 23 heritage trees were destroyed, representing approximately 3,400 years of combined growth that can never be recovered. Entire ecosystems were eliminated for profit margins. Families were terrorized into destroying their own property's ecological value through intimidation and manufactured violations. This wasn't simple property crime motivated by ordinary greed. This was environmental terrorism disguised as suburban governance, using the authority of a homeowner association to commit crimes that will impact our environment for centuries. Mr. Kim, does the prosecution have sentencing recommendations that reflect the severity and permanent nature of these environmental crimes? Federal Prosecutor David Kim stood with files documenting every destroyed tree, every manipulated property, every dollar of illegal profit, and every family traumatized by Barbara's systematic operation. Your Honor, the prosecution recommends substantial prison sentences reflecting the severity, duration, and irreversibility of these environmental crimes that destroyed natural heritage our grandchildren will never see. For Barbara Mitchell, primary architect of this 8-year criminal enterprise, we recommend 14 years federal prison followed by 5 years supervised release with permanent ban from any leadership position anywhere in the United States, plus full restitution of $4.2 million to victims and environmental restoration funds. For Gerald Mitchell, who profited directly through coordinated property acquisition schemes, we recommend 10 years federal prison with supervised release and joint restitution liability. These sentences must reflect that environmental destruction has permanent consequences that extend far beyond any individual's lifetime. Those trees can never be replaced in our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes or possibly even our grandchildren's lifetimes. Tell me in the comments, do you think environmental crimes deserve sentences as severe as other major crimes? Because what Judge Chun decided would set precedent. The defense attorneys made their predictable appeals for leniency, painting Barbara as a misguided volunteer who'd made poor decisions under stress rather than acknowledging her as a systematic environmental criminal. But Judge Chun had read every victim impact statement, reviewed every piece of evidence during the 3-week trial, and understood exactly what Barbara had done to families and ecosystems. Mrs. Mitchell, Please stand. Barbara rose on trembling legs, her former authority and confidence completely evaporated. The court has reviewed your case exhaustively over many weeks. You held a position of trust in your community for 8 years and systematically weaponized that trust to destroy federally protected habitats for personal financial enrichment. You targeted 23 families, forcing them to destroy trees that connected them to their history, their heritage, and their environmental legacy. You vandalized a federally protected specimen with herbicidal paint specifically designed to kill it from the inside. You falsified government documents to arrange illegal tree removal. You threatened witness intimidation when confronted with evidence, and when brought to trial, you showed no remorse whatsoever. Dismissing these crimes as just a tree and calling environmental protection extremism, the federal sentencing guidelines suggest 10 to 16 years for environmental crimes of this magnitude and systematic nature. However, I'm imposing a sentence at the absolute upper end of these guidelines due to multiple aggravating factors that demonstrate exceptional depravity. Abuse of position of trust over 8 years, targeting vulnerable families including elderly residents and immigrants, systematic destruction of irreplaceable natural heritage, complete lack of remorse even when confronted with overwhelming evidence, attempted obstruction through witness intimidation, and continued dismissal of environmental values during trial testimony. Barbara Jean Mitchell, you are hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years supervised release with strict environmental monitoring. You will pay full restitution of $4.2 million jointly and severally with your husband to the 23 victim families and the Environmental Heritage Restoration Fund. You are permanently banned from serving in any homeowner association leadership position anywhere in the United States, from any environmental oversight role, and from any position involving authority over protected natural resources. You will be prohibited from residing in any property with heritage trees during your supervised release. Do you understand this sentence and its permanent implications? Barbara's response was barely a whisper that the court reporter had to ask her to repeat. Yes, Your Honor, I understand. But as the full weight of 15 years sank in, something inside her finally broke completely and irreversibly. 15 years. 4 trees. She screamed with the desperation of someone who'd never learned that actions have consequences. They're just plants. They were in the way of progress and development. You're destroying my entire life over landscaping. The courtroom erupted with angry responses from the 23 families whose lives, trees, and environmental heritage she'd destroyed systematically. Judge Chun Scavell came down like thunder splitting an old tree. Mrs. Mitchell, your complete inability to comprehend why destroying 3,400 years of irreplaceable natural heritage is a serious crime only confirms the absolute appropriateness of this sentence. Those trees weren't landscaping or obstacles to progress. They were living monuments to history predating the Civil War, critical habitats for endangered species protected under federal law, and irreplaceable components of functioning ecosystems that provided environmental services worth millions. You will serve every single day of this 15-year sentence, and perhaps by the time you're released at age 7, you will have developed the capacity to understand what you destroyed and why it mattered. Barbara's final words, as federal marshals led her away, echoed with delusion that would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic and revealing. This is environmental extremism. You're punishing progress and development. But her definition of progress was profit at the expense of irreplaceable natural heritage, and that definition had just earned her 15 years in federal prison. Gerald's sentencing was equally severe and permanent. Mr. Mitchell, you're a real estate developer who built your fortune understanding property values, development potential, and market manipulation better than anyone in this courtroom. You used that expertise to coordinate with your wife's HOA authority, creating a sophisticated criminal enterprise that destroyed natural heritage specifically for profit. You personally profited approximately $4.2 million from properties acquired through systematic environmental destruction and manipulation. The court sentences you to 12 years federal prison, 5 years supervised release. joint and several restitution liability of $4.2 million, and permanent prohibition from any real estate development involving properties with protected trees or heritage vegetation anywhere in this state. Your development license is permanently revoked. You will never build in this state again. Walking out of that sentencing hearing into the November afternoon felt like watching the ecosystem restore its natural balance after successfully removing invasive species that had been poisoning it for years. Mrs. Henderson grabbed my arm with tears of relief streaming down her face after 8 years of suffering. Sarah, 15 years means Barbara will be 71 years old when she gets out of federal prison. I'll be 89 years old by then. Our 200-year-old maple tree can never come back in our lifetimes. But at least she can never destroy anyone else's trees or terrorize another family. Our grandchildren will grow up knowing that environmental crimes have real consequences. The Martinez family stopped me in the courthouse parking lot with homemade tamales and overwhelming gratitude. Dr. Mitchell, our grandfather's walnut trees that he planted in 1973, are gone forever and can never be replaced. But you stopped Barbara from destroying 20 more families, trees, and environmental heritage. You turned our tragedy into protection for everyone else. That's genuinely heroic. I didn't feel heroic standing there. I felt like a botanist who'd simply documented what was happening to the ecosystem and reported the invasive species, destroying it with systematic precision. The $4.2 million restitution was distributed according to a complex formula, developed by environmental economists and approved by Judge Chun after extensive briefing. Each of the 23 families received compensation based on documented property value loss, replacement costs for destroyed trees, calculated at mature specimen prices, and emotional damages for loss of irreplaceable natural and cultural heritage. My family received $273,000, reflecting the legally calculated but truly irreplaceable value of a 150-year-old heritage oak tree. We donated every single penny to establish what would become the Riverside Meadows Heritage Tree Protection Foundation. Tell your followers if you think this is the right way to honor destroyed trees, because what we built with that money transformed our entire community and eventually 6 counties. The foundation's mission was elegantly simple: ensure Barbara's crimes could never happen again in any neighborhood anywhere. We hired environmental attorneys to draft new county ordinances with real enforcement, teeth, and criminal penalties. We funded free legal defense for any homeowner facing HOA pressure to remove protected trees. We created streamlined heritage tree designation processes that gave century-old trees the same legal protection as historic buildings. We established emergency response funds for trees threatened with illegal removal. And, most importantly, we developed comprehensive educational programs, teaching people why old trees matter ecologically, historically, culturally, and economically. Within 2 years, our county had the strongest tree protection laws in the entire state. Within 4 years, 6 neighboring counties had adopted similar comprehensive protections. Barberas, 8. Crime Spree had inadvertently created the most comprehensive environmental protection system our region had ever seen. My 150-year-old oak tree survived Barbara's herbicidal spray paint attack, though it required emergency treatment by certified arborists who removed the poisoned bark sections and applied protective compounds. The tree lost 3 major branches during recovery, creating permanent scars that would be visible for decades. But trees are remarkably resilient when given proper care and protection. By the following spring, new growth emerged from the damaged areas. Within 3 years, you could barely tell where the vandalism had occurred except for slight discoloration in the bark pattern. That visual reminder of Barbara's crimes became an invaluable teaching tool. I started offering monthly tree tours, taking groups of neighbors and students to my oak, explaining its 150 years of history, pointing out the scars from the attack, and discussing why environmental crimes matter. 2 years after sentencing, I received a letter forwarded through the federal prison system. Barbara had been relocated to Federal Correctional Institution Danbury in Connecticut. Dr. Mitchell, I've spent 2 years thinking about everything that happened. My attorney says genuine remorse might help with sentence reduction appeals, so I should probably apologize. But I'm not writing to apologize because I still don't fully understand what I did wrong. Yes, I ordered tree removals as HOA president. Yes, Gerald's company bought the properties afterward, but we were improving the neighborhood, increasing property values, modernizing outdated landscaping. Your oak tree was blocking sightlines. We were solving problems, and you destroyed me for it. 15 years seems wildly excessive. I'll be 71 when released. Was your tree really worth destroying my entire life? The complete lack of understanding was stunning even after 2 years in prison. Barbara Mitchell is currently serving year 3 of her 15-year sentence at Federal Correctional Institution Danbury, inmate number 748291. Gerald is serving year 3 of his 12-year sentence at a separate facility. The $4.2 million in restitution has been fully distributed. 23 heritage oak saplings grow in Margaret Henderson Memorial Grove. The foundation has expanded to 6 counties, protecting over 3,000 heritage trees. And my 150-year-old oak continues growing, adding another annual ring each year, bearing witness that when you stand up for what matters, when you document injustice with scientific precision, when you fight to protect irreplaceable natural heritage, sometimes the roots you protect grow deeper than any corruption can reach. Drop your worst HOA or environmental destruction story in the comments below. Have you ever had to fight to save irreplaceable natural heritage? Subscribe to HOA Stories for more tales of regular people fighting back against environmental destruction. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's creating protection so comprehensive that the crimes you suffered can never happen to anyone else. We appreciate you spending your time with us on HOA Stories, where karma eventually catches up and documentation defeats denial. Remember, tyrants always fall, corruption always fails, and trees always grow toward the light. It's just nature.